The first hazmat suit appeared at exactly 3:47 a.m. Its yellow bulk catching the amber streetlight as it moved across the Hendersons' front lawn. By dawn, 12 more had joined it. White tents sprouted like deadly mushrooms along Maple Street, and the mechanical whir of air filtration units drowned out the morning birdsong that had blessed this quiet suburban neighborhood for decades. Sarah Chen pressed her face against her bedroom window, watching the controlled chaos unfold below. Her breath fogged the glass as she whispered to her husband, "What's happening? David, why are they evacuating the Johnsons?" 3 houses down. Marcus Johnson sat in his wheelchair on his front porch, his prosthetic leg gleaming in the harsh LED lights that federal agents had erected around his property. His daughter Emma, 8 years old with pigtails askew from sleep, clutched his arm as a woman in a CDC jacket approached them with a clipboard. "Sir, we need you and your family to vacate the premises immediately," the official said, her voice muffled by her respirator. "There's been a report of hazardous materials on your property." Marcus frowned, his weathered hands gripping the wheelchair's armrests. "Hazardous materials, ma'am. I think there's been a mistake. I'm a retired Army medic. The only thing in my garage is a science fair project I'm helping my kids with." The CDC official's eyes hardened behind her protective goggles. "Sir, we have credible intelligence suggesting otherwise. Please cooperate." Behind them, Emma's younger brother Tommy emerged from the house, rubbing his eyes. At 6 years old, he didn't understand why strangers in spacesuits were on his lawn, but he sensed the tension radiating from his father like heat from summer asphalt. "Daddy, why are the astronauts here?" Tommy asked, his voice small and confused. Marcus reached down and lifted his son onto his lap, the movement causing a grimace of pain to flash across his face. The IED that had taken his leg in Afghanistan 5 years ago had left him with chronic pain, but he never let his children see him suffer. "They're not astronauts, buddy. They're just some people who got confused about something." Across the street, Karen Whitmore stood in her bay window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed against her elbow as she watched the scene unfold. A satisfied smile played at the corners of her mouth, barely visible behind the sheer curtains that provided her cover. Karen had made the call at 2:15 a.m., her voice shaking with what she told the 911 dispatcher was terror. "There's a man in my neighborhood, a veteran, and he's been building something dangerous in his garage. I've seen chemicals, equipment, things that don't belong in a residential area. I think he's making weapons." The dispatcher had pressed her for details, and Karen had been ready. She'd been watching Marcus Johnson for months, documenting his activities, taking photographs through her telephoto lens. The science project had been the perfect cover story. She'd reasoned, who would suspect a disabled veteran of terrorism? But Karen knew better. She'd seen the way Marcus looked at the neighborhood children, the way he encouraged them to visit his garage workshop. She'd witnessed the suspicious deliveries, the packages from scientific supply companies. In her mind, the pieces fit together like a sinister puzzle. The morning news vans began arriving at 6 a.m., their satellite dishes unfurling like metal flowers seeking signal. Channel 7's lead reporter, Jessica Martinez, stood at the police perimeter with her camera crew, her expression grave as she began her live broadcast. "Good morning. I'm reporting live from Maple Street in Riverside Heights, where federal authorities have evacuated an entire city block following reports of a potential bioterror threat. Sources tell us a local resident may have been developing dangerous biological agents in a residential garage." The words bioterror and biological agents sparked across social media like wildfire. Within hours, the story had gone national. CNN picked it up, then Fox News, Then every major network. The suburb of Riverside Heights, population 12,000, suddenly found itself at the center of a national security incident. Dr. Rebecca Hayes, the FBI's senior biochemical threat specialist, arrived on scene at 8:30 a.m. She'd flown in from Washington, D.C., on a military transport, her mind racing with possibilities. In her 15 years with the Bureau, she'd investigated everything from ricin plots to anthrax scares. But suburban bioterror labs were becoming increasingly common. "What do we know about the subject?" she asked Agent Collins, the local field commander. Collins consulted his tablet. Marcus Johnson, 34, Army veteran, medically retired. Lost his leg in Afghanistan. Wife died 2 years ago in a car accident. Lives with his 2 children. Clean record. No red flags until now. Dr. Hayes nodded grimly. That's exactly the profile we're seeing more of. Isolated veterans, military training, access to knowledge about chemical and biological agents. What about the neighbor who called it in? Karen Whitmore lives across the street. Says she's been monitoring suspicious activity for months. She provided photographs, documentation. Seems credible. As the morning wore on, the evacuation zone expanded. First it was just the immediate neighbors, then the entire block, then a 3-block radius. Riverside Heights Elementary School closed, sending 400 children home early. Local businesses shuttered their doors. The community center became a temporary evacuation shelter, filled with displaced families clutching hastily packed bags and confused pets. Marcus sat in the back of an FBI van, his children beside him, as agents questioned him about his activities. Agent Collins, a tall man with kind eyes who reminded Marcus of his old commanding officer, tried to keep the tone conversational. "Tell me about your garage. Marcus, what kind of work do you do out there?" Marcus sighed, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "It's a chemistry lab. Well, not a real lab. It's for my kids' education. Emma's interested in science. Wants to be a doctor like her mom was. I set up some basic equipment. Beakers, a microscope, pH testing kits. We've been growing crystals, testing water samples from the pond. Basic stuff." "What about chemicals?" The neighbor mentioned seeing deliveries of hazardous materials. "I ordered some supplies online. Copper sulfate for crystal growing, litmus paper, distilled water, food coloring. Nothing dangerous. Everything's educational grade, designed for children." Agent Collins made notes, but his expression remained neutral. The neighbor seemed quite concerned. "She provided detailed documentation of your activities." Marcus frowned. "Documentation? What kind of documentation?" Collins showed him Karen's photographs on his tablet. Images of Marcus carrying boxes into his garage. Shots taken through windows, showing laboratory equipment. Pictures of the children handling what appeared to be scientific instruments. "She's been spying on us," Marcus said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of hurt and anger. "Taking pictures of my children." Emma pressed closer to her father. "Daddy, why would Mrs. Whitmore take pictures of us? We weren't doing anything wrong." Meanwhile, inside the Johnson garage, FBI technicians in full protective gear meticulously cataloged every item. They found exactly what Marcus had described: educational chemistry supplies, a child-safe microscope, rock specimens, and crystal growing kits. But Agent Collins noticed something odd. "Dr. Hayes, can you take a look at this?" he called through his radio. Dr. Hayes entered the garage, her trained eye immediately scanning for threats. What she saw puzzled her. Mixed in with the innocent educational materials were items that seemed out of place: professional-grade Petri dishes, bacterial growth medium, and what appeared to be a small centrifuge. "These items don't match the others," she observed. "They're too advanced for a children's science project, but too basic for any serious research." Agent Collins nodded. "That's what I thought. They look almost planted." Dr. Hayes examined the items more closely. "The serial numbers have been filed off, but there's something else. These Petri dishes have never been used. Look at them. They're still in their original packaging, but the packaging has been opened and resealed." A few blocks away, at the evacuation center, the community was beginning to fracture along lines of suspicion and fear. Some neighbors defended Marcus, describing him as a devoted father who'd organized block parties and helped elderly residents with yard work. Others whispered about how they'd always found him strange, how he kept to himself, how he'd seemed different since his wife's death. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived next door to the Johnsons, spoke to a reporter from the local news station. "Marcus is a good man. He helped me plant my garden last spring, even though it was hard for him to kneel down. His children are angels. I don't believe for 1 second that he would hurt anyone." But doubt, once planted, grows like a weed. Other neighbors began to reinterpret innocent interactions through a lens of suspicion. Had Marcus been asking too many questions about their families? Why had he encouraged their children to visit his garage? The science projects now seemed sinister, experiments rather than education. By afternoon, the story had reached cable news. Pundits debated the psychology of veteran radicalization, the ease of obtaining dangerous materials online, and the failures of community oversight. Twitter exploded with hashtags like Riverside Heights threat and Uagjuvet terror. The Johnson family became unwitting symbols in a national conversation about domestic terrorism. Senator Patricia Hawthorne, chair of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, called for an emergency hearing. If a disabled veteran can establish a bioweapons laboratory in a suburban garage without detection, we have a serious gap in our national security infrastructure, she declared at a hastily arranged press conference. But Dr. Hayes was growing more suspicious of the evidence with each passing hour. She requested Karen Whitmore's photographs be enhanced and analyzed. What she discovered made her blood run cold. "Agent Collins, I need you to see this," she said, pointing to her laptop screen. "Look at the metadata on these photographs. According to the timestamp, this picture of suspicious equipment was taken at 11:30 p.m. last Tuesday. But look at this image of the same corner of the garage, taken by our team this morning. The equipment is in a different position." Collins leaned in closer. "Someone moved it. Or someone placed it there after taking the first photograph. I want to interview the neighbor who made the report. Something about this doesn't add up." Karen Whitmore had been basking in the attention all day. Reporters knocked on her door, asking for interviews. She'd appeared on 3 local news programs, describing herself as a vigilant citizen who'd prevented a potential disaster. Her social media followers had tripled overnight. "I knew something was wrong," she told Channel 7's Jessica Martinez, her voice breaking with practiced emotion. "You develop an instinct about these things. As a community, we have to look out for each other." But when FBI agents appeared at her door at 4:30 p.m., Karen's confidence began to waver. "Ma'am, we'd like to ask you a few questions about your observations of Mr. Johnson," Agent Collins said politely. Karen invited them into her immaculate living room, offering coffee and settling into her favorite chair, the one that provided the best view of the Johnson house. "I've been documenting his suspicious behavior for months," she began, pulling out a thick folder. Late-night activities, strange deliveries, children going in and out of that garage at all hours. Dr. Hayes examined the folder. Karen had been thorough, almost obsessively so. Photographs, written observations, even sketches of what she claimed to see through the garage windows. But the more Dr. Hayes studied the materials, the more inconsistencies she found. Mrs. Whitmore, this photograph shows what you identify as a dangerous chemical setup. Can you tell me exactly what you saw that made you believe it was dangerous? Karen pointed to the image. Those beakers, the way they were arranged, it looked like a drug lab, or worse. And the children, they were wearing gloves and safety glasses. What kind of science project requires that level of protection? Dr. Hayes made a note. Safety equipment for children working with even basic chemicals is actually quite responsible. Did you ever speak directly to Mr. Johnson about your concerns? I tried to be neighborly, Karen said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. But he was always evasive, secretive. He'd change the subject whenever I asked about his activities. What kinds of questions did you ask him? Karen shifted uncomfortably. Normal neighbor questions. What he was working on. Why there were so many deliveries. Whether the children were safe around all those chemicals. Agent Collins exchanged a glance with Dr. Hayes. Mrs. Whitmore, we've spoken with other neighbors who describe Mr. Johnson as friendly and open about his children's science projects. They say he often invited neighborhood kids to participate in experiments. Well, they weren't paying attention like I was, Karen snapped. I could see things from my window that they couldn't. Dr. Hayes leaned forward. Mrs. Whitmore, we found some items in Mr. Johnson's garage that don't match the educational materials he described. Professional-grade equipment that seems out of place. Do you have any idea how those items might have gotten there? Karen's face flushed red. How would I know? Maybe he was lying about what he was really doing. The equipment appears to have been recently placed. It wasn't integrated with his existing setup, and it showed no signs of use. Almost as if someone wanted us to find it. The silence in the room was deafening. Karen's hands trembled as she reached for her coffee cup. Mrs. Whitmore, Agent Collins said gently, we've also analyzed the metadata on your photographs. Several of them were taken within hours of you calling 911, but you claim to have been documenting suspicious activity for months. Can you explain this discrepancy? Karen's facade finally cracked. Her carefully constructed persona as a concerned citizen dissolved into tears of frustration and anger. He didn't belong here, she shouted suddenly. This was a good neighborhood before they moved in. Quiet, safe, normal families. Then he comes with his wheelchair and his dead wife and his weird kids, and everything changed. Dr. Hayes felt her stomach turn as the truth became clear. Mrs. Whitmore, did you place equipment in Mr. Johnson's garage? Karen's lawyer would later argue that she'd suffered a mental breakdown, that the stress of living next to a veteran with PTSD had affected her judgment. But in that moment, facing the FBI agents in her living room, she simply broke down and confessed. I ordered the equipment online, she sobbed. I used his address, but had it delivered when he wasn't home. I have a key to his garage from when I helped with yard work after his wife died. I just wanted him gone. I wanted my neighborhood back. The revelation sent shockwaves through the media ecosystem that had spent all day dissecting the terror threat. Within hours, the narrative completely flipped. Marcus Johnson transformed from suspected terrorist to victim of an elaborate frame-up. Karen Whitmore became the face of suburban prejudice and vigilante justice gone wrong. But the damage was already done. The evacuation had cost the city hundreds of thousands of dollars. Businesses had lost a day's revenue. Children had been traumatized by the sight of hazmat suits and federal agents. The Johnson family had been subjected to national scrutiny and suspicion. As evening fell on Maple Street, residents were finally allowed to return to their homes. The white tents came down, the FBI vans departed, and the news crews moved on to the next story. But the scars remained. Marcus sat on his front porch as the sun set, his children playing in the yard with a normalcy that belied the chaos of the day. Neighbors approached hesitantly, offering apologies and casseroles, trying to rebuild the community bonds that fear had torn apart. Mrs. Patterson crossed the street with a homemade apple pie. Marcus, I'm so sorry about what happened today. I never believed it for a second. Marcus accepted the pie with grace, though his eyes reflected the hurt of being suspected by his own community. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I understand people were scared. What Karen did was wrong. Mrs. Patterson continued. She was always a busybody. But this was evil. Other neighbors gathered as word spread that Marcus was outside. The Chens brought flowers. The Martinez family offered to help with groceries. And the teenage boy from 2 doors down awkwardly apologized for believing the news reports. Dr. Hayes stopped by before leaving town. She found Marcus teaching Emma how to adjust the focus on their microscope, the same activity that Karen had photographed and presented as evidence of terrorist preparation. Mr. Johnson, I wanted to apologize personally for what your family went through today, she said. Marcus looked up from the microscope. You were doing your job, Doc. I understand that. It's the system that's broken, not the people trying to protect us. Your setup here is impressive, Dr. Hayes observed, genuinely interested in the educational materials. Your daughter is lucky to have such a dedicated teacher. Emma beamed. Daddy's teaching me about cells. Did you know some bacteria can glow in the dark? Dr. Hayes smiled, the first genuine smile she'd had all day. I did know that. It's called bioluminescence. Maybe someday you'll study it in college. The legal consequences for Karen Whitmore were swift and severe. Federal prosecutors charged her with making false reports to authorities, terrorism hoax, criminal mischief, and civil rights violations. The case became a landmark example of how prejudice and fear could be weaponized against vulnerable community members. During the trial, which began 3 months later, the full extent of Karen's campaign against the Johnson family was revealed. She had filed multiple complaints with the Homeowners Association, called Child Protective Services twice with anonymous tips, and had even contacted Marcus's former employer with allegations of unstable behavior. The prosecution painted a picture of systematic harassment driven by prejudice against veterans and racial minorities. Karen's defense attorney argued that she was a victim of her own mental illness, suffering from paranoid delusions exacerbated by too much exposure to fear-based media. Marcus testified at the trial, his voice steady as he described the impact of Karen's actions on his family. My children shouldn't have to grow up thinking that their neighbors see them as threats. Emma still has nightmares about the men in hazmat suits. Tommy asks me if we're safe in our own home. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Karen was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to the city, the FBI, and the Johnson family for their expenses and trauma. But the story's most remarkable chapter was yet to be written. Dr. Hayes had been so impressed by Marcus's educational setup and his dedication to teaching science to children that she recommended him for a position with the CDC's Community Outreach Program. 6 months after the false alarm that nearly destroyed his life, Marcus found himself standing before a congressional hearing on domestic terrorism prevention, not as a suspect, but as an expert witness on community-based education and veteran integration. The real weapon of mass destruction in this case wasn't chemicals or biological agents. He told the packed hearing room. It was fear. Fear turned neighbors against each other. Fear made people see threats where there were none. And fear nearly destroyed an innocent family. Senator Hawthorne, who had initially called for the hearing to investigate security gaps, found herself asking Marcus about solutions rather than problems. What would you recommend to prevent similar incidents in the future? Marcus shifted in his wheelchair, his prosthetic leg catching the light from the hearing room's cameras. Education. Senator. Not just for children, but for communities. When people understand science, they're less likely to fear it. When neighbors know each other, they're less likely to suspect each other. The hearing led to the creation of the Veterans Community Science Initiative, a federal program that paired disabled veterans with local schools to provide hands-on science education. Marcus became the program's first national coordinator, traveling the country to establish community labs and train veteran educators. Emma Johnson, now 9 years old, often accompanied her father to his speaking engagements. She would demonstrate simple experiments while Marcus explained the importance of scientific literacy in combating fear and misinformation. At one such event, at a middle school in Phoenix, a young girl in the audience raised her hand. "Mr. Johnson, weren't you scared when people thought you were a bad guy?" Marcus paused, considering his answer carefully. "Yes, I was scared, but not for the reason you might think. I wasn't scared of being arrested or investigated. I was scared that fear would win, that people would stop trusting each other, stop learning from each other." Emma stepped forward with her microscope, the same one that had been photographed and misrepresented as evidence of terrorism. "But it didn't win," she said confidently, "because now we teach people how to see things clearly." 2 years after the incident, Maple Street had become something of a pilgrimage site for community organizers and education advocates. The Johnson House, once surrounded by hazmat tents and federal agents, now hosted weekly science camps for neighborhood children. Mrs. Patterson, now in her 80s, had become an unlikely advocate for veteran rights and community education. She often told visitors about the day when fear nearly destroyed her neighborhood, and how education and understanding had rebuilt it stronger than before. The Karen Whitmore case had become required reading in FBI training programs, a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of thorough investigation. Dr. Hayes, who had been promoted to director of the Bureau's Community Threat Assessment Program, often used the case to illustrate how bias could cloud judgment and turn innocent activities into perceived threats. On the 3rd anniversary of the false alarm, the city of Riverside Heights dedicated a community science center in Marcus's honor. The Marcus Johnson Center for Community Learning stood on the site of the old evacuation shelter, transforming a symbol of fear into a beacon of education and hope. At the dedication ceremony, Marcus spoke to a crowd that included many of the same neighbors who had once suspected him of terrorism. His words were simple but profound. 3 years ago, someone looked at my family and saw a threat. Today, you look at us and see teachers, friends, neighbors. The only thing that changed was understanding. That's the power of education, the power of community, the power of choosing hope over fear. Emma, now 11, and already talking about studying biochemistry in college, cut the ribbon with scientific precision. As the doors opened and children flooded into the new science center, it was impossible not to see the poetic justice in it all. The garage laboratory that had been falsely portrayed as a house of horrors had evolved into a community resource that would educate thousands of children. The veteran who had been branded as a terrorist became a national symbol of resilience and service. And the neighborhood that had been torn apart by fear had been rebuilt on a foundation of understanding and mutual respect. Karen Whitmore was released from prison after serving 3 years of her sentence. She returned to a different world than the one she had left, a world where her name had become synonymous with the dangers of prejudice and false accusation. She moved to a different state, far from Maple Street and the community she had tried so hard to control. The Johnson family still lived in the same house, still worked in the same garage, still taught science to any child who wanted to learn. But they lived with the knowledge that they had faced the worst that fear and prejudice could offer, and had emerged not just unbroken, but transformed into something stronger. As the sun set on another day in Riverside Heights, Marcus sat on his front porch, watching his children play in the yard. The same view that had once been obscured by hazmat tents now showed a thriving community where veterans and civilians, children and elderly, people of all backgrounds worked together in the pursuit of knowledge and understanding. Tommy, now 8, ran up to his father with a mason jar full of lightning bugs. "Dad, look what I caught. Can we study them with the microscope?" Marcus smiled, remembering how that same microscope had once been presented as evidence of his dangerous intentions. "Sure, buddy. Let's see what we can learn." And as father and son headed into the garage laboratory that had sparked a national crisis, and ultimately a national conversation about fear, prejudice, and the power of education, the rest of Maple Street settled into another peaceful evening, secure in the knowledge that understanding had triumphed over suspicion, and that community could indeed overcome even the deepest divisions. The story of the Riverside Heights false alarm had ended, not with the dramatic arrest of a terrorist, but with something far more powerful, the quiet transformation of a community that had learned to see clearly, to question assumptions, and to choose hope over fear. It was a lesson that would echo far beyond the borders of one small suburban neighborhood, inspiring communities across the nation to build bridges of understanding where others might see only walls of suspicion.